And welcome to Georgia Southwestern State University. I'm Professor Bonnie Levine Berggren, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Global South Lecture. This lecture series is named after and endowed by the late Professor Emeritus Harold Isaacs, who served as a history professor at Georgia Southwestern for 49 years. During his tenure at GSW, Professor Isaacs taught courses in Latin American history, African American history, and established minors in Black Studies and Third World Studies. In 1981, he launched the Third World in Perspective seminar series, and 2 years later, he established the Association of Third World Studies. In 1984, Professor Isaacs started the Journal of Third World Studies. This journal addressed the problems and issues facing the less developed countries all over the world. Following his death in 2015, the name of the journal was changed to the Journal of Global South Studies and is now published by the University of Florida on behalf of the Association of Global South Studies. As part of his bequest to GSW, Professor Isaacs requested that part of the monies be used each semester to bring a guest speaker to campus to talk to our campus community about issues and opportunities that are facing the Global South. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Elaine MacKinnon. Dr. MacKinnon is a professor of history at the University of West Georgia and has been teaching there since 1995. She's earned a Ph.D. in modern European history at Emory University. She is the author of The Forgotten Victims, Childhood and the Soviet Gulag, and the translator and editor of the memoir Gender and Survival in Soviet Russia. Most recently, she co-authored with Dr. Aaron MacKinnon A View of African Interests in the War on Ukraine, the Past and Future of the African Struggle for Non-Alignment, and she contributed a book chapter, Up to Their Old Tricks Again, Taking Mothers from Their Children, Eugenia Ginsburg as a Mother in the Stalinist Gulag. Welcome, Dr. MacKinnon.
Thank you. And I want to thank Professor Levine Berggren for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity. And I want to thank all of you for coming and listening. I always like to give a little caveat at the beginning. I am a historian. I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not a political prognosticator. And I don't even do history of international relations or foreign relations. My historian, most of my work has been on the Soviet Gulag and survival in the Soviet Gulag. But nonetheless, I do often speak on contemporary Russia and contemporary Russian issues, and I'm just as interested in what is going on today as in the past. So this talk and my engagement in looking at what Russia has been doing in Africa actually comes out of my concerns as an historian, because I'm going to be talking about Russia's growing footprint and engagement in Africa since 2014, and I wasn't really aware of it until this 2 years ago in February of 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and began this horrendous war. It's really disrupted my career as a historian, because increasingly it's impossible to travel to Russia, and the kind of research that I want to do on the forced labor camps in the Stalinist era is no longer acceptable, and those materials are not available. So I was appalled at the time, and I continue to be appalled by this war. But what happened as the war unfolded, to make me aware of what Russia has been doing in Africa, was the fact that a few months after the war began, the United Nations, United States, in the United Nations and European countries passed a resolution to condemn the war. And in the proceedings of that resolution, over half of the countries in Africa either refused to support the resolution or they abstained. And that was a real shock to a lot of people, and it caused a lot of, wow, what's going on? Why is it that African countries who have been the victim, who have been fighting against colonialism and imperialism, since the 19th century, why would they be in support of a country which is engaging in very obvious imperialism, territorial aggrandizement against another country illegitimately? So that's what kind of got me interested and kind of probing into this and finding out that actually since about 2012, 2014, Russia has been increasing its engagement. And there are a lot of, good reasons to explain why African countries supported or just did not support condemnation of that resolution. So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is, I'm going to talk a little bit about what this engagement is. Then I want to step back as an historian and try to explain the context within which this growing engagement has taken place. There is a historic context, and there's also a contemporary context for it. And the disillusionment, the disappointment of the global South in policies and actions of the United States and other Western countries, the emergence of alternative power brokers like China and India and Russia. So there's a contemporary context as well. So I want to touch on that, and then I'll return back and look more in detail at some of the ways in which Russia is engaging with Africa, and why I think it's an issue that we should be aware of, we should be talking about. As I say, I did not really have any idea that this was happening until that, the African response to 2022 and the Russian invasion. And please, at any point, I know we will leave time at the end for questions, but I love to have questions while I'm going along, so don't hesitate to ask questions, just raise your hands, and I'll do my best to see that you're asking a question. I get caught up sometimes. So I titled this, just trying to be, cute, I suppose, The Russian Bear on Safari. And who are the Russian bears? Well, of course, there are thousands and thousands of Russian soldiers and businessmen and mercenaries who are on the continent. But in particular, the two driving, the two individuals, the two actors who are most responsible for what's been going on are the man on the left in particular. He's no longer with us. Yevgeny Prigozhin was the founder of a group, of a private military company called the Wagner Group. And he really paved the way with that private military company in 2017, 2018 in military interventions and basically offering up military security and training and weapons and so forth in return for concessions to minerals, to gold, to diamonds, and so forth. We'll talk more about him. He's a former criminal. He spent 10 years in Soviet prisons for theft, for violent, armed robbery and violence, but when he got out, he, basically developed a business sense and ended up. He was referred to as Putin's chef because he ran catering companies that brought him into the, that's how he met Putin, was by catering Kremlin events. And he has, he was allowed by Putin to create a $1 billion network of companies that were operating in Africa. Now, Prigozhin, again, we'll talk later, he is now dead because he attempted in June of 2023 to carry out a mutiny that was not directed personally at President Putin, who is the leader of Russia and has been the leader of Russia since 2000. But it was, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about it later, it was with relation to the Ukraine war, not to his engagement in Africa. But it ended up, getting on the wrong side of Putin, and 2 months after he attempted the mutiny, his plane mysteriously blew up. and he was killed in August of 2023. So, but he, you know, again, the imprint, the legacy that he left with that private military company of Wagner is very important. And of course, President Putin himself, who has been really since 2012, 2013, 2014, been engaging in policies that have increasingly brought him into conflict with the West, the United States, with Europe. And so his turn to Africa really came in response to, in 2014, Russia annexed territory known as Crimea, which was Ukrainian territory, but Russia claimed it, took control of it, and that prompted sanctions and condemnation from the West, and that is really what led him to focus back, or to you know, begin looking for other allies, for other potential places to get resources and so forth. And so that was really the stimulating event that led him to look back. And I keep saying look back at Africa because we're going to talk in a minute about the historic context for Russia's engagement in Africa comes from the Soviet period, from the Soviet Union. And Putin himself is a former officer in the KGB, the Soviet security services. And during the Cold War, especially in the 1960s and the 70s, the KGB had many, many operations in Africa, running a lot of intelligence operations. And so Putin has really been able to build upon those old contacts and probably some of those old techniques. I mean, disinformation and fake news is not a 21st century phenomenon. It was rampant during the Cold War as well. And the KGB was very much engaged in that in Africa during the 60s and 70s. So you know, Putin's background and ties and connections have definitely fed into the successes that Russia has had in Africa. So, and you know, just a kind of symbolic representation of the friendship, the growing bonds between some African countries and Russia is just this mural which appeared in Burkina Faso, which is one of the countries where Wagner definitely has been deeply involved in, just to kind of show symbolically and visually the bonds that are developing between Russia and these countries. Now, so just to, again, give you kind of an idea of, this is just a map showing these colored areas are areas where these private military companies like the Wagner Group have been operating, have been sending mercenaries, sending, you know, it's military supplies, advisors. They also bring economic and technical experts, because also it's not just, as we'll talk about, it's just not military, it's not all military. Some of it is working with media and working with social media and creating media partnerships. But those are the areas of Africa where in various ways these private military companies, and that's a preferred mode of operation for Russia because, I mean, again, it's an old Cold War tactic of plausible deniability. You know, these are private companies that are not directly funded by the government, by the Kremlin, but they're nonetheless supported through back channels, and they are definitely pursuing the interests of Russia. So that's been the main way that these interventions and alliances have been carried out, is through that. And that just gives you an idea of some of the extensive nature of it. That's just an image of Russian mercenaries in northern Mali. I have a chart here that, again, gives you some of the countries where there has been direct military engagement. A lot of this is through these companies like Wagner sign sort of contracts with regimes, especially ones that are governed by military, they carried out a coup and you have military officers who are in power. That's the case in the Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, I didn't list Burkina Faso, but that's one of them as well, that they sign a contract and then they send their mercenaries and they're there on the ground, they're providing security. A lot of these countries are facing civil unrest and civil conflict and Islamic insurgencies, and so they contract with these private military companies to deal with those insurgencies. In a lot of cases, the Russian mercenaries are replacing like French troops that were once, or UN troops that were once trying to perform these functions. These juntas or governments that have come into power since 2019, 2020 have pushed out those European troops and they're turning to Russians. But they, in addition to military, as we'll talk later, there's also economic ties. There are economic and cultural, a lot of cultural ties. I mean, Russia is definitely opening the doors of its universities to African students. They're offering scholarships. So the engagement of Russia is, mostly military. That's the bulk of it. And that's probably, to me, the most disturbing part of this. But there's also an economic side and also a cultural and educational. And it is having an impact. This might be a little bit of a confusing chart, but it's basically, they did a public opinion poll last year based on the question, which foreign actor do you trust the most? And Ghana, Ivory Coast, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria. And you can see here that Russia is now the country that at least 3 of these trust first. And that's, you wouldn't have, that would not have been the case if you had done this in 2010, 2011, and it's certainly displacing the United States and certainly the United Nations. So again, just in addition to their support for Russia in the UN resolution, not condemning it, they're also, definitely Russia's media campaigns and propaganda campaigns are definitely bearing fruit, at least in some of the countries. So I want to turn now just to talk about this historic legacy. And again, you don't have to, I always put way too much information on PowerPoint slides, and my students are always telling me that it's too much. But you're not having to take notes, so it's okay. I mean, essentially, Russia as a whole, in its long history, has not necessarily been deeply engaged with Africa. During the period of Imperial Russia, if you've ever studied Russian history, they fought a lot of wars against the Ottoman Empire, and that included, the Ottoman Empire included Egypt and North Africa. But Russia really was not interested in the continent of Africa. Russia did not take part in the scramble for Africa in that new imperialism of the late 19th and early 20th century. Now that is a factor in Russia's favor, that it doesn't have that colonial legacy and colonial past. But it's even more important that it's after 1917, when Russia experienced revolutions that led to the establishment of the world's first socialist state, and one governed by what we call Marxism-Leninism, Marxist philosophy, the idea of workers, the world revolution taking place and workers overthrow capitalism, overthrow the middle classes and factory owners, and they rule. That philosophy also included, at least for Vladimir Lenin, who was the first, he was the leader of this revolution and the leader of, his ideas are why we call it Marxism-Leninism. Lenin believed in, he wanted to reach out to colonial peoples and engage them as allies. And he saw that in 1917, that imperialism was the last gasp of capitalism, so we need to ally with them. So already in their ideology, there was an opening to colonize peoples, and this was long before decolonization began after World War II. So a number of later nationalist leaders definitely got interested or involved in communism, and some of them joined the organization known as the Communist International. Now, under Stalin, who succeeded Lenin, Stalin didn't have any interest in Africa at all. So he didn't follow up, and he didn't even agree with Lenin necessarily that colonized peoples are ripe and ready to be an ally to the working classes. But after Stalin died in 1953, when another leader came to power, a man named Nikita Khrushchev, that's when things changed. And of course, this is also when the Cold War began. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union, which had come out of World War II as the two, the real only two superpowers in the world, because Europe was devastated, the Soviet Union and the United States get into this global rivalry and competition. And some of that involved competition for for client states, for allies. And so that is when, Africa became a place of interest for the Soviet Union. And Soviet propaganda reveals to us, though, for the Soviet Union, they began to champion anti-colonialism. They began to, really strike a bond. And again, propaganda is propaganda. It doesn't. The Soviet Union actually didn't have a lot of funding, a lot of money. They weren't that. It's not like they had a lot of funds to put into Africa. They mostly helped with military, even then, with military supplies and so forth. But the propaganda, shows a recognition and a bonding with African and African peoples and their struggles that presented a stark contrast to the United States and to countries of Europe, which were reluctantly giving up their colonies. And so it was the Soviet Union in 1960 that sponsored in the UN the declaration of, sort of ending colonialism. And that, that gained a lot of, support for the Soviet Union in Africa. And they are, when, again, I don't know if you've ever studied the crisis in Congo in 1960, again, it became part of the Cold War. The first prime minister of Congo, Patrice Lumumba, was, assassinated in the course of their struggles for Congo to become fully independent. He was assassinated with the assistance of the CIA and Belgian officers. Well, in the wake of that, the Soviet Union became a great champion of Patrice Lumumba and celebrated him as a hero. Whereas, the United States, we contributed to his assassination because we didn't trust him and we feared that he was a communist, that he was going to ally with the Soviet Union. But in Africa, Lumumba was seen as a martyr, and it was the Soviet Union that tapped into that and fully believed in it themselves. And so again, I have more images than I can even show here. There's lots of interesting images of Soviet propaganda, leading Soviet artists who contributed to support for anti-colonialism, anti-imperialist movements, which they always associated with the West, and celebrating in their media, in their own publications. So there's lots and lots of images that you can find. But they also do something else, which is very important. Again, that's too much to read. But they established a university in 1961 in the name of Patrice Lumumba. And they made it a university that opened its doors to students from Africa and from all over the former colonial world. And they, in the course of it lasted, as the name of Patrice Lumumba, the university in the name of Patrice Lumumba, lasted from 1961 to 1991. Now, it still exists. It's no longer named after Patrice Lumumba. It's just the Russian People's University. But in that time frame, again, more than 7,000 students from 48 African countries studied there, earned degrees. And, again, that carries a lot of memory. And there are still graduates of that university who are, leading individuals in African societies. And so that memory of that has definitely helped Russia And so there is this, context of Soviet support for African people and for African, needs and efforts. And it was a multicultural university and it was in Moscow. And again, some of the leaders in Africa studied there and earned their degrees there. And as I say, the university still exists today, but it's now it's the Russian People's University. But it still welcomes students from all over the world, and it is offering. Russia's just announced it's going to offer even more scholarships to African students. And they studied not just in this university, but they studied in universities all over the country. And that continues to be the same today. Now, in addition to this educational outreach, though, it was also that the Soviet Union provided military assistance. And again, this is sort of like the foundation of what these private military companies are doing. For, movements, liberation movements, for Marxist movements, decolonization began in the late 50s in Africa, but there were still some countries like Mozambique and Angola and Namibia and of course South Africa, which were still battling colonialism into the 80s and 90s. And the Soviet Union provided a tremendous amount of military support to a lot of the parties that were fighting against apartheid in South Africa, like the ANC, the African National Congress. And this is just one example of, they had all of these military training camps in the Soviet Union where they brought guerrilla fighters and, again, freedom fighters from various anti-colonial movements and parties to these places. And again, over the years of its existence, 65 to the late 80s, thousands of Africans came and were trained there. And here is really where you have a lot of, again, when Russia decided to re-engage with Africa after 2014, there were a lot of individuals who have this as part of their background, who definitely were, willing to talk to Russians, willing to make these deals because of the fact they had these ties and connections. So that Soviet legacy has been very important. And a lot of these military training camps, again, were run by the KGB and by the military intelligence, and that's, that kind of background and experience has fed into Russia's success. Again, a lot of military assistance. And again, the contrast, with the ANC, it was considered a terrorist group by the United States. We labeled Nelson Mandela a terrorist until 1990, but the Russians celebrated him, the Soviets. They celebrated him, and they welcomed Thabo Mbeki, who was the second president of South Africa. He trained and studied in the Soviet Union, and Jacob Zuma, also a future South African president, also studied there. So that legacy is very important, and Putin has been able to tap into that. Now, there also is, again, a context, and I can come back to this during questions if you want to talk more about this part of it. Putin is definitely promoting an anti-Western, anti-American agenda and message, and that has resonated with a lot of the countries of Africa and Asia because they're disappointed in especially with the pandemic and the debt crisis that so many of these countries face, and they feel as if they've been let down by Europe, by the European Union, by the United States. And so he's really been able to find a receptive audience with his notion of multipolar blocks, no more American unilateralism. We want to have alternative, multiple power blocks. And Russia has been very active in advocating for African countries to join these power blocks. You've probably heard of BRICS. In fact, Russia's hosting this alliance, this group of emerging economies BRICS started out as Brazil, Russia, India, and China coming together, trying to find common ground and presenting an alternative to the G7, an alternative to the IMF and the World Bank. And Russia was responsible for bringing South Africa into that. So it went from BRIC to being BRICS. And this week, he's courting, he wants Ethiopia and Egypt to consider joining. You know, so again, in a way that the West, the United States certainly has not been doing, Russia has been seeking to engage African countries and African leaders and presenting them with the opportunities and alternatives to the past. Russia has also written off billions of dollars of debt that African countries have incurred. And that's a very, a serious problem facing a lot of African countries is the debt and inflation rates that are exceedingly high. Russia was also very active. Russia was in a race during the pandemic, in a race to develop the first vaccine, and Russia did. And their Sputnik vaccine, they were better than the West was in getting those vaccines into places like, African countries, whereas the West was very reluctant, to open that up. So again, there's a context within which we can understand, why it is that, why it is that countries would support Russia despite their support for Russia, especially with regard to the Ukraine war, is not that they support invading Ukraine, but they just, they want their voices to be heard, and they have reasons why they need to engage with Russia. Russia is a big grain exporter. 30% of the grain that African countries buy comes from Russia. So, so again, there is a context. All right. So let's look at, how Russia is engaging. Again, way more than I can talk about. But and I want to say again, the military presence and the military engagement is the most disturbing to me. And these private military companies are not a good thing in my view. But it's not the only way in which Russia has been engaging. And I've talked a little bit about this already. Russia has been, the volume of trade between Russia and Africa has doubled and tripled since 2012, 2014, and especially grain. Now, Russia's been sending shipments of free grain. Now, that's a bit, Russia has also been responsible in preventing Ukraine from being able to send its, Russia has caused food shortages and caused the breakdown in the distribution of grain, but then has jumped in to offer free grain to countries in Africa, despite the fact that it was the reason it happened in the first place. But, countries where they have been engaged in militarily, they're also, providing free grain. And again, African countries have been suffering over the past decade severely from climate crisis, from climate disruptions. There's been lots of flooding and lots of famine or flooding. The weather, just as we've seen with these hurricanes that have been just incredibly powerful. Africa also has been suffering. So there's a lot of issues that they have to deal with that, Russia's there to provide some answers for. And then, as I said, they've also been very, very active in penetrating, getting in with cultural and educational facilities and opportunities. They're offering free Russian language courses in like 26 or 27 different African countries right now, and that's expanding. They offer in person, they offer online classes, and they are definitely welcoming, African students into the universities and providing scholarships. And that's, again, a contrast to the United States, where education here is extraordinarily expensive, and most African students can't even dream of it without scholarships. But that is closed down. Fears of immigration concerns, border concerns, and issues of political unreliability and all that again present a stark contrast to what Russia has been doing. But let me now turn to the military side of things. And again, private military companies, but even Russia as a whole, officially, is the leading supplier of arms, weapons, military equipment to African countries. 44% in the period 2017 to 2023, it was, double and triple what the United States is the next largest supplier, but it's much lower, 17%. So that's, again, a very major way in which Russia has been increasing its engagement is through, and they're cheap arms, and they also match well the already existing military material that a lot of these countries have from the Soviet period, because the Soviet Union was the primary supplier. So that's made it even easier for Russia to offer arms that match what they've already got. They're also negotiating these military agreements, and those are where they, on the cheap, again, they're able to provide military and security services to governments, to regimes, and they're cheap, they can afford them, but in return they're getting majority and monopoly concessions, access to mineral resources. So a lot of these governments are essentially selling off their major natural resources in order to have Russian mercenaries be their bodyguards. So in a number of these countries, Russian companies, and that's where Wagner comes in, that's what Wagner was. It was a billion-dollar network of mining companies and financial companies, in addition to the military side, where they are, taking over mines and taking over mines from local people and using them entirely for Russian purposes. So these military agreements are, primarily agreements of military security in return for concessions. And again, the founder of all this was Yevgeny Prigozhin. And it's this odd thing, when Russia engages in Africa, they like to use former Nazi or German-based terms, and I don't know why, but that's apparently Wagner was named after Richard Wagner, the German composer, so beloved by the Nazis. And we'll see, again, Wagner is dead, and he was killed, assassinated in a plane bombing, or plane crash, plane blew up. Russia has basically taken over much of the Wagner group, and they created an expeditionary force that is mostly former Wagner mercenaries, and they call it the Africa Corps. Further slide, and the Africa Corps, that's a name of a Nazi unit that operated in World War II in Africa. So I don't know why, but that seems to be the trend. So again, a little bit disturbing. But again, the Wagner Group was the first of these private military companies to really make major inroads into Africa. And it only dates back to 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea. If anybody was paying attention then, you remember they talked about little green men who appeared in Crimea and helped with the annexation. And they weren't official Russian soldiers, but who were they? Well, they were Prigozhin's people. And that was the beginnings of what became the Wagner billion-dollar network of companies. Was Wagner created these units, again, not official, but they could go in and do what they wanted, no accountability. So they were involved in Crimea, and then there were two breakaway republics in eastern Ukraine that emerged in the wake of the annexation of Crimea, and Wagner, the beginnings of Wagner operated there. And then in 2015, when Syria began to experience further civil conflict, that's where Wagner, Prigozhin created Wagner, sent units to Syria to be involved in the civil war there, and then in 2017, 2018, they were invited in the Central African Republic to support a president who was facing a number of different insurgencies and opposition, Faustin Arcon Caldera. And so that was one of the first major sort of demonstrations of what Wagner could do, what it could provide. And so these particular services, and especially to autocratic states, regime survival packages. So again, that's part of what's disturbing about this, is that they're not going in necessarily to quell civil conflict, but they're propping up particular power brokers in government and getting involved in whatever it takes to support that particular commander or particular autocrat. So that was, but the other side of it, again, there's a context here. These, how much time do I have?
3 to 5 minutes.
In 2011, the United States had engaged or intervened. NATO troops went into Libya and caused, overthrew Gaddafi, and in the end, actually caused a tremendous amount of chaos, and a lot of the armaments, and so forth were broken into, and a number of different groups then took those arms into what's called the Sahel region. And that's in West Africa, so countries like Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, which is where Wagner was brought into, they suffered a tremendous amount of insurgencies and Islamic extreme groups rising up, taking these weapons and creating a great deal of chaos. So part of why they hired Wagner and hired these was to put down those insurgencies. And the European troops and the UN troops that were there were not doing, not very effective. And so Wagner came in and did it. But, the problem with Wagner and its actions is that they have been implicated in human rights abuses. Again, there's no accountability for these private military companies. So they have been, documented as committing they carry out tortures, they carry out summary executions, they have been known to, commit, gang and mass rapes and, massacres of entire villages in these regions where they're, helping the government, put down violence, put down these insurgencies. So there's, a lot of questionable roles that they have been playing. Now, and as I say, that Russia has taken it over, but I'm running out of time. And so now, by creating the expeditionary force of the Africa Corps and then taking over some of these companies that were part of this Wagner network, Russia is now directly negotiating and gaining these concessions. And Russia currently in West Africa is working on getting them to change their laws so that it will cut out all other European mining companies and just allow Russian mining companies to come in. So, and France is very concerned about that because France gets a lot of uranium from this region. But I'm just going to close here. Oh, and Russia conducts disinformation campaigns, and election interference is another big one. But I want to just come back to why is this a problem? It actually is not that different from what imperial powers have been doing in Africa and even in the post-imperial power. Everybody just out for their own interests. But nonetheless, I do think that there is a reason to be concerned about this. There are these private military companies, as they say, they've been implicated in a lot of human rights abuses and a lot of atrocities against civilians. They're not really there they're not helping people on the ground. They're helping and propping up mostly autocratic regimes that, there's more slides here that give evidence of various countries across, like Cameroon and Mali, where Russia's directly, voting down UN resolutions that were trying to get governments to carry out reform, they're really stymieing corruption, attempts to reform and get rid of corruption in a lot of different systems and governments. This is also a disturbing statistic that I came across, where in every country Russia's involved in, they're not really doing anything to help quell the insurgencies or terrorism, that it's on the rise. And 48% of all terrorism-related deaths in 2022 occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, and 3 of the countries are the ones where Russia's been most engaged in. So I do think that this is something which, I said it's understandable, there's a context for it, but it is something that the United States and Europe should be, and they are. This is not news to our government or to the European Union. They are working and trying to address some of these issues. But, above all, the West and the United States, we have to recognize that the world is, it's a different world now. And that there are these alternatives out there. China is more than happy to offer investments and offer funds. And so the United States is going to have to really rethink the way that we, that we approach Africa and African countries. And, again, follow the lead of Russia in welcoming African leaders to the table, not just about African issues, but about global issues. And we've got to compete. We've got to offer more than what China has to offer and what Russia has to offer. We may have to be willing to not just take black and white approaches or, good, bad approaches to countries and say you can't, if you want to deal with us, you can't deal with Russia at all. And if you do that, then we're not going to help you. And that's not a very helpful approach. And likewise with these military juntas, as much as, okay, they're not perfect, well, they're not great at all, but, they've come to power through coups, but, we have to look deeper and see, well, why did that coup take place? It may not, there are a lot of experts and a lot of specialists who are saying, it's not as though these countries where coups have taken place in Africa, it's not as though people don't want democracy. They do, but they were tired of the corrupt governments that were in place. And in part because of our own, nonchalance, we allowed countries to, governments to stay in power, despite the fact they were violating their own constitutions, because we just didn't want to bother with it. A lot of this has happened during the time of a presidential administration who just wrote Africa off and doesn't consider it an important place. And unfortunately, that may be coming back. And this may get even worse if that happens, if the United States decides not to, look at the world as a place to engage with and to work with, and to recognize that, we cannot be unilateral anymore. Now, I'm probably am I out of time?
We can go into questions.
Yeah, I've said enough. As I say, I'm sorry I never get through everything in a lot of slides. I got caught up in the slides with desire to look at that Soviet period and all that interesting propaganda. But you don't have questions?
No questions?
Yes. And say your name if you don't mind.
My name is Cecilia. My question is, so what is the U.S. and Europe going to do about it? You said that they're doing something.
Well,
the problem is also that we will have to deal with legislation that they don't follow some of the countries in Africa. So you have to sacrifice our idea, our ideology to go into some of those countries, because how it is right now, I guess that the U.S. and the European Union will have to do something about it and not just sit there and wait for Russia.
We have to sell democracy more than we are and make it clear. I mean, again, you're going to have to potentially deal with people that you don't like and people who are violating the principles. But we've done that before. It's not as though we have not backed a lot of dictators simply because they promised not to be, communists. During the Cold War, we upheld some of the most atrocious dictators on the African continent. Hutu in Zaire is one of the worst. So, I mean, the United States is where, I mean, you know, there's all kinds of we've had a lot of Lincoln, a lot of government officials, you know, going across Africa, trading barbs with the Russian foreign minister, trying to make alternative, you know, going to these same countries and trying to offer, you know, that we can do something for you, we can help you. Some of it, you know, this part of the problem is we're going to have to, and this is, I'm not a specialist in economic, you know, matters here, so I'm basically just trying to think about what some of the specialists have said, that, you know, you have to be willing to, and it's difficult, but you have to be willing to write off debt, to, you know, recognize, because that's one of the things that Russia and this BRICS group want to do. They want to create an alternative to the IMF, an alternative to the World Bank, which puts very, very strict requirements on governments that they're going to get funding. They have to be willing to carry out very, you know, pretty strict reforms that don't, you know, that often cut off funding to health care, cut off funding to people. And that's what we're going to have to be willing to step back from and not, you know, think that that has to be done every time. That that's the, you know, there's only one pattern, that we have to look at what's going on in the country and try to remind them that, you know, prosperity comes more from, you know, with democratic regimes than they do from countries that just completely shut everything down and have such tight government control, especially when the government is filled with corruption. So, and there's no easy answer to this, and it will, of course, be, you know, it means investing a lot of time and thought and energy and listening to African leaders themselves, not just coming with a blueprint and saying this is what you have to do. They have to, you know, welcome them. I mean, again, Russia, Putin has been advocating for the Security Council to be expanded in the UN to allow, you know, African countries to come. And that's what we have to be willing to do. And we just, you know, the West has not been, you know, that's been on the back burner. That hasn't been a priority. But it's going to have to be. I mean, another slide. I mean, Africa, in about 50 years, Africa is going to have 1/4 of the world's population. You know, Africa is where, you know, the population is growing. Nigeria, in about 50 years, I think I saw a statistic, is going to be the 3rd most populous country in the world. It's going to overtake the United States. So it does matter, but it, you know. So I don't have, like I said, I don't have an easy answer. You know, it's going to be hard to counter a lot of what Russia is doing. And like I said, these private military contractors and this Russia expeditionary force. I mean, the one thing I guess that might help us is that Russia, I mean, they have huge oil and gas reserves. Well, they have a lot of money, surplus money to spend. But the Ukraine war is very expensive. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make that point. They're getting these concessions. The gold that they're getting from these deals with Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic, the gold that they're getting, that's how they're avoiding sanctions. That's how they're funding the war in Ukraine, is by these, you know, what they're getting out of these African countries they're using. And Wagner was very good at that, because he was, you know, again, he was a criminal mind, and he set up this network and all kinds of, you know, companies that don't exist, and money, you know, being transferred that they were able to completely, you know, sanctions don't mean anything to Russia because they've got all of these. And how you stop that? That's you know, some of you I know are business students, so you can probably offer more on that. I wish I had an answer to that, but it's just, you know, we just got to do a better job of selling what is good about us, and being willing to recognize that, you know, inflation and debt and famine and all of that is something which, you know, we have to do something about that. And if we don't, then, you know, they're going to get their cheap grain from Russia. So, any questions?
And that was
And you had a slide on the Russian disinformation.
Yes.
What were some of the examples you had from that?
Oh, there's a lot. I mean, again, Russia has been very good at that. You know, that's something which the KGB developed early on in the 60s and 70s So what it is a lot of it is creating, social media sites and paying influencers, African influencers, to basically, promote Russian interests in Russian propaganda, anti-Western propaganda. Just a couple of weeks ago in Burkina Faso, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been funding, experiments and attempts to develop a malaria-resistant mosquito species that they want to create and then introduce into parts of Africa where malaria and malaria-related diseases are deadly. And so what Russian disinformation has done is to make claims. They've experimented by introducing this malaria-resistant mosquito into some villages in Burkina Faso. So Russian disinformation, put out the news that they were actually infecting people, that they were purposefully, that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was purposely introducing and releasing malaria-ridden mosquitoes and causing these huge, death, wiping out entire villages. And of course, none of that was true, but that's the sort of information campaigns that they put out, and that's just a very recent example. But Wagner was Prigozhin, and I think he himself had some talent in this, but setting up I'm actually very dinosaur-like. Troll farms, that they set up. And again, these, YouTubers who have hundreds of thousands of followers, that they then, again, promote these kinds of rumors, these kinds of accusations. They've also formed media companies and media partnerships. There's, Russia has this huge conglomerate of media, television called Russian television, RT. And they operate all through the world, and again, promoting Russian interests and propaganda. And they have signed a number of agreements in different African countries to operate, to run their media, give them, a great platform, as long as they promote Russian interest in Russian views of the Ukraine war, which is completely distorted. So that's what's getting being disseminated. They also, in return, they make deals with certain candidates when there are elections in these countries. Candidates pay them, and then they spread disinformation about their opponents. They're shutting down the countries where these companies are operating, again, Mali and Sudan. They're shutting down any non-Russian media companies like the BBC or any Western news outlets. They're just censoring them. So unfortunately, the Russian model is not a good one. Russia is a complete autocracy under Putin, and in fact, besides this the African response to the Ukraine war, the other kind of first time I ever heard of Wagner was in 2018, when there were 3 Russian journalists who were, all of a sudden we heard that these 3 Russian journalists had been killed in the Central African Republic, that they had been ambushed and basically blown up by a car bomb. And it was like, what were these Russian journalists doing in the Central African Republic? Again, nobody really knew what was going on. But it turns out they were killed by, the Wagner group, because they were trying to show what was going on there. So that's the model that is now happening. And again, journalists and those who are trying to report, anything contrary to Russian information is, they face that sort of consequence. So it's quite varied and very extensive, because Russians have, mastered these systems and social medias. So.
We have time for one more. Does anyone?
If there isn't one that's directly on topic, then it's slightly off topic, but you brought it up. Putin has been trying to reform Stalin like the image
Yeah.
of it,
Oh, yeah.
and I'm just
Yeah.
curious, with your expertise on Russia, has that trickled down to their educational system? Has
Oh,
that
yes.
reform been injected
Oh,
into the
yes.
educational system as well?
Oh, yeah, Putin has ordered, about 5 years ago, they ordered new textbooks had to be written for Soviet history that present Stalin as the great war leader, and, I mean, that's how it was, up until the thaw in the
Well,
50s, that there were, a tiny little mention of, there were some problems, a few people died, but otherwise, the country grew. He's the great industrialist, Russia industrialized under Stalin. Stalin won World War II, so yes, that has trickled down to the educational systems, and now you can't teach anything that doesn't, go along with that. Because, now that they've even revived the old informants, teachers have been informed on, if they're critical of the Ukraine war, they find themselves, in jail, arrested. And there was a terrible case of an historian who was very, involved in continuing to uncover unmarked graves of Stalinist victims, terror of, there were lots of mass shootings in the 1930s. And he was uncovering them in this one region of northern Russia. And, he fell under the radar. And so what they did was they trumped up, using their media savvy abilities, they trumped up charges accusing him of child pornography because he had a daughter who had a disability. And so he had to have photographs of her for like a doctor, submit to the clinic. And so anyway, they trumped that up, and he's in jail for 25 years in the camps. So it's, so yes, and they have, it's being enforced very strong. So that's, actually one of they did for a while, for a few years, have one of these forced labor camps in the Gulag. They had it as a museum, and now it's been completely transformed into like the exhibit of the workers of the, the northern, industries. It's just been completely transformed into it's very Stalin-like in the language that they're using to cover up and completely interpret Stalin's period. So,
Thank you.
yeah, it's awful.
Thank you, Professor MacKinnon, for your participation this evening. Thank you also to the students, faculty, and staff for joining us, and for GSW TV for filming this event. Good night.